partnership. Yeah. So that's what the letters, all three letters need to attach, and I'm wondering if those goes as
That doesn't inspire confidence.
I don't think there's a place in that. I think so the grants, if there are attachments, you just come in. Okay, so we've got those three letters plus the agreement with the city. So those are all ready to be attached. They're all signed by all the residents.
That would have been
Oh,
last
I'm only
weekend as well.
asking.
James's team did well with the Science Olympiad, and so they're going to the finals this weekend, and his robot is doing the finals tomorrow.
Did you all make any
For that, I wasn't quite ready, so he needed the extra time.
There were a few
So
businesses.
it was on the calendar, there was space when they
What
planned
Brendan
it,
knew
and
which ones
then
those were.
it just got too crowded.
Okay.
Try
It was
maybe in the summer.
stuff like that.
I don't know. We'll see what his summer plans work
Yeah,
out
yeah.
to be.
All those things.
There was a research thing
No,
out
it
in
was
Boston,
great. You guys.
Rise, I think it's called, that he
And I know
made
that
the short list, and now they're trying to match him with a faculty member to do research with. But there are more students who made the short list than there are faculty looking, so it's pretty competitive, and he hasn't been selected yet, so we don't know.
So because
He would be, so
the day before.
yeah, he's thinking about applying to Harvard early in decisions,
You went in the morning.
one shot, all of his eggs. And if that doesn't work, then he'll apply to more.
Look at it, everything is yellow. And so I don't know what it. I don't know what it added either, and I started heating my name. Did not. It was just to check on myself. I know, but I don't think
It was still,
I don't know what Kelsey did.
it's like a percent or two better chance that it doesn't
I
work.
just had yellow, nothing is green. I couldn't tell what he did. Okay, then
The
he should add
rejection is the only way to get him to start looking at the secondary schools.
I think at this point we're good with that. So the goal is for Kelsey to finish getting that stuff in. And then we will submit it. I think we have all the.
I think we have everything, yeah.
So, yes.
Good.
Okay.
And
Well,
as soon as
then
it's
we'll
engineer.
we'll send it.
And now he's
I'll
regretting that he didn't say that, but,
It's not anymore. And Dean walked Rachel around last week, so I don't think we need to, I don't think they need to do an additional site
Yes,
visit. I think
I have
Rachel's
a
just
cousin
gonna
who
check
did
that
it.
one out. It's done. How's that? So thank you for everything. Yeah, didn't we all?
Well,
Yeah.
MIT really looks more at creators, people who build things and invented things and that kind of stuff. And he just doesn't have a track record of that. So, I mean, if he doesn't get into teaching, it's definitely some application this way, but
I hope we
he's
can.
suggested he has a less.
No, we can go ahead and go. You ready? Yes, I will just sit down and.
So yes, good afternoon, everybody. It's 12:01. So good afternoon. Welcome to our Brown Bag series. I'm Dr. Linda Van Ingen, Chair of the History Department, and we host this history lecture series in conjunction with the Kearney Public Library. So we always appreciate that collaboration, and thank you for your support. So we have a schedule of Brown Bag talks. We do it on the second Wednesday of the month. And the ones that are coming up in May is Dr. Nathan Tye. He's going to talk on Willa Cather's Kearney. He's a professor in the history department. And then on June 14th, we have coming up Professor Lorinda Weissy. She is our archivist in the library at UNK. And she's going to talk about extinct education, Nebraska's rural school past. So that sounds good, June 14th. And you can find our list on our webpage for the history department. So our talk today is Danish and English competition in the North Atlantic during the 16th and early 17th centuries. And our speaker is Dr. Beth Ailes. She's a professor of the history department, and her area of specialty is early modern Europe. So what's really fun about history is you not only travel across time, but you can travel across cultures, and you can do both time and culture at the same time without leaving home. So here we're going to be in 16th and early 17th century Denmark and England. Dr. Ailes, her research specialty is Scandinavia, the British Isles, military history, diplomatic history, and social history. And she has published widely in these areas. She's got several articles and 2 monographs, 2 books that investigate connections between warfare and societal developments during the early modern period. So her first publication was Courage and Grief, her first book, Courage and Grief, Women in Sweden's 30 Years' War, published by the University of Nebraska Press. And her second book is Military Migration and State Formation, the British Military Community in 17th Century Sweden, also by Nebraska Press, and that came out in 2000. I had it backwards, 2002 and 2018 are the 2 books. So I'm very happy to present our speaker for this month, Dr. Beth Ailes.
Well, thank you for the introduction. Can everybody hear me? All right, so, and I want to thank the History Department and the Kearney Public Library for sponsoring this event. So I'm going to be talking today about English and Danish competition in the Atlantic during the 16th century and the early 17th century. And this conflict arose out of English exploration of the North Atlantic. And it has to do with fishing rights and Denmark's sovereign rights to the area, as well as trade within this region. And as the English began to explore and begin to fish and to trade and to claim territory, this ran them into conflicts with Denmark because Denmark believed that they had sovereign rights over this entire territory. So we're going to be talking about that today. And I'm going to begin by giving a little bit of background about the origins of this. And so let me put this up. So, oops, scooped in too much. Okay. Oh, I'm going over here. There we go.
Is it now working?
Let me see. I'll just go back through the whole thing.
I'm sorry.
I'm giving you a preview of what I'm going to talk about today. Try this.
Do you want the mouse instead?
There. Okay. Right. I'm going to use the mouse and not the clicker. Okay. So the Europeans began to really explore the Atlantic in the 1400s, and it starts with the Portuguese, actually. And this is a map showing Portuguese voyages. And what they were concerned about was trying to find a sea route between Europe and Asia. And so starting in the early 1400s, the Portuguese crown began to send voyages out to explore the west coast of Africa. And over the course of the century, they worked their way further and further and further south. And what they were concerned about was that in Europe, they didn't know if Africa connected somehow to another southern continent, or if it was actually possible to sail around the southern tip of Africa. The person who discovered this is Bartolomé Diaz, who in the 1480s, that's the orange route, is able to sail around the southern tip of Africa. Unfortunately for him, his crew mutinied when he got to South Africa, and so he wasn't able to make it the whole way around and out into the Indian Ocean. But at least he proved that you could sail around the southern tip of Africa. Vasco da Gama, whose voyage is in green, finally completed this in the 1490s and sailed around the southern tip of Africa, sailed up the east coast of Africa, and then off to India. And after he had done this, then the Portuguese continued to send out voyages, and many other European states as well. At the same time as the Portuguese are doing this, there's also an interest in whether there are other potential routes. And probably the person who's the most famous for exploring this is, okay, there we go, it's Christopher Columbus. And so Christopher Columbus would go on 4 voyages, which are depicted in these different colors on this map. His first, of course, is in 1492, but his last is in 1504. And over the course of these 4 voyages, he explores the Caribbean. He lands in the coast of South America and lands in a couple places in Central America. Now, Columbus is really interesting because his whole life, he held fast to the idea that he had actually reached Asia. And he kept just saying, you know, if I could just sail a little bit further west, I'd find Japan and I'd find China. But there were other people who realized fairly quickly that he actually had found someplace else. And this, in fact, was not Asia. And shortly after he had gone on his voyages, the Spanish crown who had sponsored his voyages, wanted to capitalize on what he had done. And so they continued to send out voyages. And over the next few decades of the 1500s, they conquered and took control of the Caribbean, of Central America, and of the western parts of South America. And the Spanish Empire, by about 1560, is all this territory that's in pink. So they rapidly expanded and took control of this area. So while the Spanish are doing this, other European leaders are also interested in doing the same thing and seeing if they can also sail out into the Atlantic, find some territory that they can claim control over. And one of the earliest outside of Portugal and Spain is Henry VII, who is the King of England. And he's the king from 1485 to 1509. And pretty much as soon as Columbus had gotten back, he decided to send out his own voyage into the Atlantic. And so he employed a man who's known in English history as John Cabot. And 1497, Cabot set sail from the west coast of England and traveled across the Atlantic. And it's not exactly certain where he landed, but most likely he explored the coast of Newfoundland and of Labrador. And when he returned to England after this voyage, Henry VII began to refer to the lands that John Cabot had explored as newfound land. And this gets then sort of smushed together later on to become Newfoundland. And that's where you get the name of that Canadian province that he most likely had landed in and explored during this voyage. So once this had happened, then Henry VII and Henry VIII and his children who were kings and queens after him continued to send out voyages. So over the course of the whole 1500s, the English are sending out voyage after voyage after voyage into the Atlantic. And as they explore this, they land in different places. They basically look around to see if there's any other Europeans, and if there aren't, they sort of say, oh great, nobody lives here, from their minds, and that we can claim this as our own. So they're also claiming land. As there's more exploration of what's going to become North America, it becomes clear that this is probably not going to be possible to really get across this without some real effort. And so there's a growing interest in the later 1500s to see if they can sail around it, and especially they're interested in seeing if they can find a northwest passage. Is it possible to sail this way? And the geography is not understood at all, so they really don't know what's out there, but they're hoping they can sail up around the northern tip. And so they begin to send out voyages to explore this. And probably one of the most successful and famous of these explorers is a man whose name is John Davis. And this is a map of his routes. He goes on 3 voyages between 1585 and 1587. And he explores the west coast of Greenland. So he's coming this way, and he sails the whole way along this area up here until basically he runs into ice. But he maps all of this. And he lands in several places and has contact with the Inuits, the native peoples of the Arctic. And there's accounts that to make them see them as the English as friendly, that he's brought like some musicians with him. And so he has the musicians sort of get out on the ice and play music, and the sailors dance and whatnot to show that they're not like threatening. So he does that, and then he sails across, and he goes and explores Baffin Island, and then sails further south and explores Labrador. But he's also going around and claiming this for England, so he names it. So, for example, down here, this becomes known as the land of desolation, the southern tip of Greenland. And then there's no better way to stake a claim to something than name the whole coastline. So this is the London coast that he's naming. Now, they're not only looking for a northwest passage, but they decide to see if they can also find a northeast passage. Maybe if it's not very easy to sail northwest around America, maybe you can sail northeast around Europe and Asia and get to places like China and Japan. And so the English send a voyage in 1553, led by Willoughby and Johnson. And they leave England and they sail along the north coast of Norway. And then this map's a little bit inaccurate. They probably actually go even further north, but they eventually run into ice. And then they turn south and they go into the White Sea, which is here. And they land and then they travel overland down to Moscow. And when they're in Moscow, they make a trade agreement with the Russian leadership and to enter into trade with each other. When they get home, the English government decides to capitalize on this. And so they found what's called the Muscovy Company to organize merchants to be able to engage in yearly trade following this route. And this is a long, difficult route that's especially once you get into the Arctic waters north of Norway, you run into ice and icebergs and storms. It's not easy. But they saw this as a great route because the only other way they could go is through the Baltic over here. And the problem for that was that the entrance to the Baltic was controlled by Denmark. And this is a map of Danish territory. So Denmark was a much different country during this period of time than it is today. It consisted not only of modern-day Denmark, but they also controlled the southern coast of Sweden as well as Norway. They also controlled Iceland, the Faroe Islands, this is a small series of islands that's located about halfway between Norway and Iceland. And then they also controlled Greenland. And so the only way that you can sail between the North Sea over here and the Baltic over here is if you go through this narrow body of water located right here, known as the Sound. And in order to, the Danes controlled both of those coastlines, and then so they would charge tolls. So everybody who's sailing through there has to stop and pay money to the Danes, and the Danes inspect their cargo and decide if it's legal or not, or if they should keep a share of it or whatever. And so in order to ensure that they could do this, the Danes in the mid-1500s built what's known as Kronborg Castle, and it's located at the town of Elsinore. And you may know this much better because this is where Shakespeare set his play Hamlet. So Hamlet takes place in Elsinore, Kronborg Castle. And so this is what they built to guard the entrance to the Baltic. And where they build it, the Sound, this is this body of water out here, is really narrow. So this is the Danish coast, and today that's the Swedish coast, that's the east coast of it. And so it's only about a half a mile across. And as you can see, this is as if you're standing with the castle at your back and you're standing on the coast with the guns. And so the Danes could fire on anybody who tried to run this. So it was really pretty much impossible to escape having the Danes inspect your cargo and take a share of it and make them, pay tolls and whatnot. So literally sailing around Norway and up into the Arctic was seen as a better route, surprisingly enough, given that there was always potential problem with the Danes. So they're out there, they're exploring to the northwest, they're exploring to the northeast, and especially in the northwest, they're claiming control of territory. But the other thing that they're doing out there is fishing. And they're particularly fishing for cod. Cod was really a prized fish in Europe during this period of time because what would happen is that it could be dried and it could be essentially made into like fish planks. It was sort of almost like the consistency of wood, and then you could stack it up, and it was really light and easy to transport, and it didn't need any other preservatives. And it was particularly well suited for sea voyages because you could just get a whole stack of dried cod and have protein for people, and you didn't have to preserve it in any other way. And the main fishing grounds for cod are in these blue sort of spotted areas, so they're all along the coast of Norway, out here in the North Sea off of England, but then around the Faroe Islands and around Iceland. And the English in particular start to engage in deep sea fishing in the 1400s. And the reason for that is by around the 1300s, there was evidence of overfishing in European waters. And so they began to sail to go further and further out in the ocean looking for fish. And the best fishing grounds were around Iceland and around Norway. And so in the 1400s, you have English fishermen who are going and fishing in these areas. And especially in Iceland, they also are not only fishing, but they're causing problems with the locals because they would land and then they would demand lodging and food. And if people resisted, they would beat them up or steal stuff from them. So there were lots of complaints filtering back to the Danish crown about English fishermen harassing the people who lived in Iceland. So the Danes, as they get word that all of this is going on, is that the English are fishing in their waters and that they're sailing around and planting the flag and naming coasts and in territory that the Danes are pretty sure belongs to them. And are sailing, and once the Muscovy Company gets started and they're making these yearly voyages, along Norway and fishing and trading and all this, the Danes are getting more and more worried. Now, interestingly, the question then arises of why do the Danes feel like they have a stake in all this? And it dates way back to the Vikings. And during the Viking period, Scandinavians, mostly from Norway, but also somewhat from Denmark, sailed out across the North Atlantic. And they reached the Faroe Islands here by the early to mid 800s. There's no specific dates for this. And these were uninhabited islands. So they began to settle them and farm. But then as further waves of migration came westward, eventually all the good farmland was taken. And so then newer immigrants had to go on further west, and they eventually came to Iceland. And they settled Iceland in the late 800s, early 900s. And eventually all the available farmland was gone in Iceland. And so then new waves of immigrants had to move even further west. And so by the late 900s, you have Scandinavian settlement in Greenland. And in Greenland, there were two main settlements. One is this one in the south, and that's known as the Eastern Settlement. And then this one up here, which is known as the Western Settlement. And from these, then, they would go on to North America. And the only known Viking settlement in North America was at L'Anse Meadows. And it died out or they left, we don't know. But it lasted maybe 10, 15, 20 years. And then they seem to have left and have all gone back to Greenland. So in the 1200s, the Icelanders and the Greenlanders and the people in the Faroe Islands decided to place themselves under the control of the Norwegian king. They did this for security and to ensure international and foreign trade in their lands. In the 1300s, the Norwegian family dies out, mostly due to the plague, but there had been extensive intermarriage between the Norwegian and the Danish royal families, so Denmark and Norway become united. So when that happens, then the Danes take over control not only of Norway, but of all of Norway's North Atlantic territories. So that's why, as all this word is filtering back about these activities of the English, the Danes feel like the English are intruding on their territory. So then they decide, okay, we've got to do something about this. And the very first question that they experience is the issue about fishing. Fishing is sort of the earliest time or issue that crops up in terms of problems. And so in the 1400s, as this gets to be a real issue, and as there becomes words that English fishermen are landing in Iceland and causing problems, they decide to negotiate a few treaties. So the Danes and the English signed a treaty in 1465. And in this treaty, the English agreed that they can't sail to Iceland and they can't sail to Norway unless they have the Danish crown's permission. Well, this unfortunately doesn't stop anybody from fishing. So they meet again in 1490 and they make another agreement. And this time, the Danes say, okay, we can't stop you from fishing, so you can go ahead and you can fish, but you have to buy a license from us. And I think this is very generous of them. They say, and you only have to buy a license once every 7 years. So people want to fish, that's fine. You just have to buy a license from us every 7 years, and then you can go ahead and do that. Now, neither of these agreements held up. None of them did anything to stop anybody from fishing. But it's important because the English government was recognizing that the Danes had a right to regulate activities in waters around their coastlines. And so that's the real importance of it. So it's not really until the late 1500s that the Danish crown really decides to really do something concrete about this. And part of the reason for that is that in the early 1500s, the Danes were consumed with the Reformation. And then the Reformation spawned a civil war, which they had to fight bitterly for a long time, and that eventually was settled. And then that was followed by a series of wars against Sweden about who was going to be the big power in the Baltic. Finally, once all that dust was settled, and the Danes sort of came out triumphant through all of this, that was all settled by about 1570. And then the Danish king could turn his attention to the North Atlantic, which had been this sort of festering issue that they were getting more and more worried about. And the king, at the time, is Frederick II. This is a picture of him. He's king from 1559 to 1588. And he decides that he's going to try to deal directly with the English and try to make them aware of this problem. So he sends a letter off to Queen Elizabeth, who's Queen of England from 1558 to 1603. And he says to her, you know, we have these treaties from the 1400s that say that people either are supposed to get our permission to go to Norway or Iceland, or they're at least supposed to buy a fishing license from us, and nobody's doing that. He said, so this is only legal, and you got to get people to stop. And so she replies, and she says, you know, I had my secretaries look into this, and they can't find a treaty from 1465, and this is the one that said they can't sail to Denmark to Norway or Iceland. And so she says, you know, and I don't see anything about that we can't sail through your waters. And so she said, so I think we should meet. We should set up a diplomatic meeting and have a negotiation about how to handle this. And so they agreed that they're going to meet at the city of Emden. And I couldn't find a map from this time period, but this is a modern map. So this is modern day Germany, and here's the Netherlands. This is Denmark up here. So Emden's right here. And it was a self-governing city in what was the Holy Roman Empire during that period of time. So they set a meeting for there. And they are agreeing that they're going to meet on July 24th of 1577. So the Danes arrive the day before the appointed meeting date, and they proceed to wait. And they wait for about a week, and the English don't show up. And the English don't send any word. They have no idea what's going on. They've never heard from them. So the Danes leave, and one of their representatives had a home near Hamburg, which is just over here. So they travel from Emden to Hamburg, and then they hang out in Hamburg for a while, for about another week. And then the English finally get a message to them saying, oh, we're sorry, we got delayed, but we're going to come. So they show up a few days later, so they start on August 10th. And on August 10th, the Danes pull out all the treaties from the 1400s and say, look, here they are. And look, and there's your king's signature, and there's our king's signature. And they read them to them. They just stand there and they read them out loud to them. So the English go away, and they come back a few days later, and they say, yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. Yes, we agree. We signed off and said we can't sail to Iceland or to Norway. They say, but you know what? They don't say anything about that we can't sail past Norway or Iceland. So these are void. And the Danes come back, and they debate, and they come back, and they say, you know what? Yes, you can sail in the ocean, but we have these agreements. And so new interpretations of these can't supersede what we agreed to before. So they spend a few more days arguing at cross purposes, and then the Danes say, okay, we're not going to accomplish anything, so they call the whole thing off, and they all go home. So with diplomacy failing, Frederick II decides to try a more direct tact. And he decides to send out a voyage to Greenland. That if he's pretty certain that the English that the land that they're claiming is sort of doesn't belong to anybody, actually belongs to them. So he wants to send a voyage to Greenland. He does this in 1579. And the directions that he gives to the voyage is to go out, find the Scandinavians who are living there, make contact with them, see how they're doing, sort of reestablish ties and whatnot. And these two settlements that existed there, the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement, at their heights, they consisted of about 5,000 people. So they were pretty sizable settlements. And they also had all the trappings of medieval societies. So they were Christian, they had churches, they had a monastery, they had an archbishop who was appointed by the Pope. They were really highly developed societies. But unbeknownst to the Danes, these settlements had disappeared. And they had disappeared sometime by the late 1400s. And nobody knows what happened to them. This is one of these sort of great mysteries. And there's lots of scholars today who are still studying Greenland and the Greenland, Scandinavians and whatnot to figure out what happened to them. But at the time that people like John Davis were landing there in the 1580s, they didn't encounter any Europeans, and they didn't find any evidence of European settlements. It was just as if the whole thing had been picked up and poof, just disappeared. And there's been a lot of theories about what happened, and they range from that all of the Scandinavians packed up their belongings and jumped on ships and went to America. Others are that the climate during the 1300s and the 1400s got a bit colder, and that maybe it reached a point where they couldn't grow crops anymore, so they just succumbed to sort of deprivation and disease and starvation. The current theory is that what probably happened is that as the climate got colder and it became more difficult to farm and whatnot, that perhaps younger people began to move away, and that people just sort of trickled away in one or two pairs or families or whatnot, and that they moved gradually back to Iceland or to Norway or to the British Isles, and that as that happened, probably the communities reached a tipping point where they couldn't reproduce themselves anymore, and they eventually died out. But nobody knows for sure, because there's just not enough. There's enough evidence to make educated guesses, but not enough evidence to know definitively what happened to them. So they're expecting that there's Europeans still there, but there aren't. So he sends out a voyage in 1579, and because the main settlement down here is known as the Eastern Settlement, they assume it's on the east coast of Greenland, even though it's not. And so they're supposed to sail to the east coast of Greenland and make contact. They get there, but they're not able to land because they run into ice and they run into bad weather. And after a few weeks, they are starting to run low on supplies, and the crew is starting to get scurvy. And they decide that they just need to go home. So they go home, and that doesn't work out. In the 1580s, there begins to be a thaw in the relationships between England and Denmark. And it's because the English need friends. All the tensions that are developing that will lead up to the Spanish Armada and the Spanish trying to invade England in 1588 are brewing over the course of the early 1580s. And the English at this point need friends. And so, and they especially need friends who are Protestants, because there's all these tensions between Protestant England and Catholic Spain. And Denmark is one of the major Protestant kingdoms in Europe. So they send off diplomats to the Danes to say, hey, let's be friends and let's strike a deal. And so they enter into negotiations again, and they make a new settlement, and they say that the English can sail in Norwegian and Icelandic waters, but they have to make annual payments to the Danish government in order to do that. And so that settled things a little bit, except that merchants and fishermen and traders and whatnot initially make these payments, but then after a few years, a lot of them just decide to just run the risk of hopefully not running into any officials, and they just don't make these payments. And it becomes easier to do this because the king is Christian IV, and His father, Frederick II, dies in 1588, but when Christian becomes king, he's only 11 years old. And so the king is a boy, and the government has concerns about, consolidating the monarchy and all these other things. They just can't pay attention to the North Atlantic. But Christian becomes king in 1596, and he is really, he's really bright. He's a real go-getter. He's super, super ambitious, and he really wants to make Denmark a major power player on the European scene. And so one of the very first things he does is he wants to cement control over the North Atlantic, and he wants to stop the English from engaging in what he sees as illegal activity. And so what he decides to do is in 1599, he decides to take matters into his own hands. And he leads a voyage, personally leads a voyage up through Norwegian waters, up to the Arctic, and then he spends several weeks patrolling all of this. And to really be sure that he could do this, he took 8 warships, hundreds of sailors, and most of the members of the Danish court went with him. He took hundreds and hundreds of people on these 8 warships to go up there and patrol. And what they do is they stop ships and say, let us see your papers and let us see your license. And anybody that doesn't have a license, they confiscate their cargo and their ship, and they arrest all the crews and haul them onto Danish ships and put them in irons. They handcuff them to the deck. And they just keep them on the ships as they patrol back and forth, rounding up people and rounding up ships and cargo. After a couple of weeks of doing this, he decides to release the English prisoners, and what he does is he puts them in little lifeboats next to the shore and says, okay, have fun getting home, see ya, and they sail off with all their cargoes and ships and everything and take it all back to Denmark. So, if relations had been sort of bad between the English and the Danes before, they were just horrible after this. And so, over the winter of 1599 and 1600, Christian IV and Queen Elizabeth exchange a whole series of really angry letters between each other. And eventually they decide that they probably should meet and try to diplomatically deal with this issue again, because neither of them really actually want to go to war. So they decide they're going to go back to Emden, to meet and try once again to negotiate and settle all this. And so this time they're supposed to meet March 23rd of 1600. And the Danes run into bad weather, so they're about a week late. But they get there, and again, the English don't show up, no word from the English. This time they wait a month. And finally, on May 9th, they say, with no word from the English, they say, this is ridiculous, we're not going to stay anymore. And they decide that they're going to leave the next day. Well, May 10th, literally as the Danes have raised the anchor, put their sails up, the wind's starting to fill the sails, the English show up and say, hi, here we are, let's go, let's meet. And the Danes say, we're absolutely not going to meet with you people. You've kept us waiting all this time. And the English say, no, we want to meet. And the Danes say, okay, we will meet if you come to our ships immediately and meet with us right now. Well, the English don't want to go onto Danish ships because it's considered Danish territory, and that would make them look weak and all these things. And so they try to negotiate. And the Danes say, no, we're going to leave. And they start to sail away. And one of the English desperately jump into a rowboat and try to row out to the Danes. And the Danes set sail and just barely miss having to meet with them as they're sailing away. So that didn't achieve anything. So tensions continue to be bad. And so they agree that, okay, they probably should try and meet again. So this time they're going to meet in Bremen, which is just over here. And they're going to meet in 1602. This time, everybody shows up on time. Everybody gets there at the appointed time, and they meet. But this meeting doesn't achieve anything either, because the Danes have been empowered to only talk about specific complaints of particular fishermen or merchants, mostly the people whose cargo they seized. But the English want to talk about, can the Danes claim sovereignty over the whole North Atlantic, or the seas free for everybody to sail in? And they talk about this for a couple months, and then the Danes say, we're not empowered to talk about this. We can't talk about this stuff. We can't make any decisions. And so they call the meeting off, and everybody goes home. Well, 1603, Queen Elizabeth dies, and the next king of England is James I, who's King of England from 1603 to 1625. And during this time, the relations between Denmark and England undergo a thaw, and it's because James is married to Christian IV's sister. Her name's Anne. And James and Christian have met each other, and they know each other, and they get along, and they're friends and whatnot. And so when James becomes king, he writes to Christian and says, I know that there's been problems in the past, and there's been some tensions, but hopefully, you know, because of our good relationship, we can figure something out. And Christian doesn't answer that, actually, because he has his own agenda of wanting to continue to cement his control. But there at least are friendlier sort of ties between the two. So the next thing that Christian does is he decides he really wants to show everybody, not only the English, but other European states, that Greenland actually belongs to Denmark. I mean, everybody agrees that Denmark belongs to Denmark, but there's this whole issue of, because the geography isn't really understood, as like the English are landing along the Greenlandic coast, they keep saying, well, you know, this might be Greenland, but we don't see any Europeans living here, so it probably isn't. And so they want to really cement control over this. So he decides to send out some voyages. And the first voyage takes place in 1605, and they're again supposed to go out here and find the Scandinavians. But this time he says, okay, you couldn't land in the east, so go over to the west and see if you can find the Scandinavians. And so the voyage sets out, and it actually makes it. It lands. And they actually, because they don't have any idea where the Scandinavians were supposed to be, they actually explore mostly up in this area. And they land, and they engage in a lot of trade with the Inuits. The other thing that they do, interesting enough, when they're going to leave, is that right before they leave to come home, they drop off a criminal on shore to leave him there as a punishment. And so they had been ordered by the crown to take this criminal and transport him to sort of the farthest reaches of the realm. And so they drop him off in Greenland and then sail away. So I think that's really interesting, because I think it's an expression of their sovereignty, that they're trying to show this is our territory, and we can transport, you know, sort of our unwanted criminals off to, you know, the far reaches of our realm. So they get home, and this is seen as this huge diplomatic triumph. And Christian IV sends out letters to all the major leaders of Europe, as well as gifts. He sends out like the items that they had traded the Inuits with. So Inuit produced articles are sent off to different rulers in different parts of Europe as sort of proof and as gifts that this had happened. He follows this up in 1606 with another voyage, and this time it's got a bit of a different purpose. On the 1605 voyage, they thought they discovered silver, and they brought back some what they thought was silver ore, and so everybody was super excited. So they were sent out to go out there and mine as much of this stuff as they could. And so they bring back huge cargo loads of this stuff that they think is silver, but they get back to Denmark, and it's tested and whatnot, and they find out it's not silver, and it's utterly worthless. So that's a bit of a disappointment. So he finally sends out another voyage in 1607, again, to find the Scandinavians. And his thinking is, okay, you explored the West Coast, and even on the second voyage, they explored the West Coast and didn't find any evidence of Europeans. So he said, okay, so now go back to the East Coast. Maybe we got it wrong, and maybe they live on the East Coast. And the directions for this voyage are really interesting, because he gives them very detailed instructions about the names of the fjords that the Scandinavians live on, and where their farms are located, and what the farms are supposed to look like. And he says to them, when you find the Scandinavians, you're supposed to be nice to them and invite them on board the ship and give them food and give them drink and show them a good time and really show, you know, that you're friendly and interested in them. Okay, so be nice. Second, find out who their leader is, okay, who's been governing them all this time. Third, and I think this is totally ironic, they say, we also want you to find out who they've been paying taxes to and where that money is. Because of course they want their 200 years worth of back taxes, because nobody's been in contact with Greenland for 200 years. So they're supposed to go out, be nice to people, find out who the leader is, and find out where the tax money is. So they sail off. same thing happens as happened earlier. They get to the East Coast, they're blocked by storms and ice, and they can't land. And so after a couple of weeks, they just turn around and come home. And so this is the last voyage that the Crown sends out during the 1600s. But this does reestablish permanent contact between Denmark and Greenland. Because after this, what starts to happen is that the Crown grants licenses to particular Danish merchants to go out there and engage in trade. And so there aren't royal voyages sponsored, but there's merchants who are, every several years going out and engaging in trade with the Inuits. In the 1700s, the Danish crown would send out missionaries to convert the local peoples to Christianity. And at that point, they establish missions and they bring in settlers from Denmark. And so it's in the 1700s you start to see Danes immigrating to Greenland and Danish settlements being established there. But it's these first voyages that Christian IV sends out that has reestablished that permanent contact. After this, Christian IV's attention turns away from the North Atlantic. He will go on to fight a war against Sweden just a few years later. And after that, then he gets involved in the 30 Years' War down on the continent, and that almost consumes the rest of his reign. And so he's much more concerned about Baltic issues and continental issues. But after this, so in conclusion, the Danes were never able to fully assert that they controlled the whole North Atlantic. They never could do that. But their foreign policy, I think, has some important impact and some important issues that come out of it. The first is that, beginning with Frederick II, his insistence that the English abide by their earlier treaties, raised the issue that the Danes had rights, at least over territorial waters, the waters along their coast. And although the English really didn't want to accept that, they eventually begrudgingly sort of had to accept that, yes, the Danes do have the right to regulate fishing and trade and navigation along their coastlines, that there really is something as known as territorial waters. Then Christian IV's much more direct actions, especially sailing to the north of Norway and controlling all that, really preserved Danish control over that region and showed that Danish control over the Arctic and that area didn't just sort of exist based on tradition, but based on the fact that the government could send people up there and regulate what was going on. And during that period of time too, he also had a fort built up on the Arctic coast. It was about right here. And that was designed to ensure that people tried to, or that people would pay like their tolls and fishing licenses and things like that. And then with his voyages to Greenland, he reestablishes permanent contact with Greenland. And as the geography became better known to the North Atlantic, the English eventually realized that yes, in fact, they probably were really landing in Greenland and it really didn't belong to them, even though they weren't finding other Europeans there. And so they eventually give up or I should say they stopped claiming Greenland as their territory or what they think had been something else. And so, this is one of the first times that these issues had come up. And there was no international law during this time period, but the Danes insisting on their rights over coastal waterways and over territory in the Atlantic really raised this sort of issue of that, how do you deal with issues of territoriality over the oceans and international waterways, and what's territorial water and what's international water. And these issues wouldn't be settled for a very, very long time, and still even today there's controversy about this, but in Europe, this is one of the first instances of these sort of issues being hashed out amongst different powers. So does anybody have questions? We have a few minutes left. Yeah.
The thing I was wondering about, you mentioned that I think it was like 1465, and then maybe in the 1490s, there were a couple of treaties between England and Denmark over you know, from the way you described them, at least, it sounded like Denmark was ceding a lot to England. Like they were granting them the right to, you know, fish. And what were the Danes getting out of it? Or were the English powerful enough to tell the Danes that this is what we're taking and you're going to sign this treaty and like it?
Yeah. What was happening is that the Danes were not in a position to really regulate fishing at this point. They just didn't have the naval forces or the political resources to really enforce any of this. And so they knew that the English were fishing there and that they were landing and harassing people and whatnot. And so with these two different treaties, they couldn't stop the English from doing that, but they wanted to at least establish the precedent that the English couldn't that this was Danish territory and they just couldn't do whatever they wanted. And then if they could get them to agree to pay the Danes for the right to do this, at that point, that was about the most that they could really hope for. So I think they were really more interested in establishing a precedent that, you know, their control didn't just exist on paper, that it actually really meant something. Anybody else? Yeah.
Could you talk more about the Inuits in Greenland when those arrivals came? I mean, was it a large, sizable population? Were they also along the coast there? And was there any evidence that contributed to the disappearance of?
Yeah, it's interesting. The Inuit who were there, I should preface this by saying there's no written records, so it's all based on archaeology, or it's based on oral tradition that was passed down through the native populations over the centuries. But the Inuit who were there at that time, that were themselves, interestingly enough, relative newcomers, there had been earlier groups that lived sort of up in this region when the Vikings were there. The Vikings were down here, and there was some contact between the two groups, mostly trade, and they'd run into each other when they were, because this up here was where the Vikings oftentimes went in the summers to hunt. And so they'd run into each other in terms of hunting and whatnot. But I think it's around the 12 and 1300s, there's a new group called the Thule who are up here in the Canadian Arctic, and they migrate eastward, and then they come down into this area. And it's the group that was there before the Thule got there also sort of disappeared. And there's, you know, it's not really known for sure what happens. But the Thule are a new group that are coming in and seem to be displacing the older native population. And there's some accounts of some fighting between the Thule as they're coming further south and the Vikings. And so that's one theory, is that the Vikings get slaughtered by the natives. But there hasn't been there isn't any archaeological evidence to support that. There are some ruins of European buildings dating back to the Viking Age, but they don't show signs of attacks, like they're not burned down, or they're not, you know, and so they don't know. And that's one of the big mysteries of all of this, is that there's like some foundations of buildings and some ruins from the Scandinavian settlements in Greenland, but they look like it's just from sort of neglect, but there's no evidence of like an attack or of some sort of destruction. And the other thing that's very strange is that the Europeans, that when they lived there, had a lot of European animals with them, cows and horses and pigs and things like that. But they were all gone by the late 1400s also, as were most artifacts. And so it looks archaeologically like that people packed up and left, because there's not a lot there. But then there's scholars who've said that if 5,000 people got up and left, somebody would have noticed. I mean, especially if they went back to Iceland, That's a lot of people to dump into a new community. There would have been some record of that. Or if they'd gone to the British Isles or even to Norway, hundreds and hundreds of people doing that, somebody would have noticed. So it's very strange. Nobody knows what happened, and the archaeological evidence leaves a very puzzling and strange sort of picture. Other questions? Yeah, Chris?
Did the Danes have different relations with like Scottish leaders throughout this time, or were they kind of reaching separate agreements with the Scots?
Yeah, the Scots were involved in exploration during this period of time, and it was just the English that were. So when during Queen Elizabeth's reign and earlier during like Henry VIII and Henry VII, and the first agreement I think was signed with Henry V. It was all done with England because England was the major power that was going out fishing and then exploring. The Scots were involved in that and then once James becomes king and he unites in a personal union England and Scotland together. He has a better relationship with Christian IV, and so things become less tense. I mean, Christian's still trying to assert his authority, but he doesn't have the same sort of tense relationship. But it more has to do with the Scots aren't involved in this. Yeah.
When did they start referring the English Empire to like Great Britain or United Kingdom? Was that when they unified Scotland? Is that when they started calling it like the British are coming and all?
Yeah.
When did they stop referring to England? I know England took all that.
Right.
When did they start changing the title? So to speak?
Yeah, that's in the early 1700s. There's with James I, the crowns are united in one person, but in the early 1700s, there's a formal unification of England, Scotland, and then England and Scotland, and it becomes the United Kingdom, and that's at the point where so they have like the Scottish Parliament is disbanded, and they start sending representatives to London to the United Kingdoms.
I know the Union Jack was pretty much just a hybrid.
Right.
Of the English and Scottish and the Irish and Wales thing.
Right. Yep.
I was just curious on when they changed names. So to speak.
Yeah, that's when it happens. Is when they're formally unified into one political unit in the early 1700s. Anybody else? Yeah.
May I have another? What was the, you mentioned, I think it was like the very late 15th century, that they had the second meeting at Emden and the British didn't show up, the English didn't show up, and didn't show up, and didn't show up.
Mm-hmm.
Did they have some incentive for that? I mean, were they no longer as concerned with uniting with Protestant Denmark? Or was it just bad luck that they didn't show up for a month?
Yeah, I think it's I think it's due to a number of different things. The English actually didn't start even planning for that voyage until the day after the meeting was supposed to start. So it was really a deliberate decision. But
That's me and my income tax.
yeah. But Elizabeth was notorious for not making up her mind. And she drove her ministers crazy because she seemed to she wouldn't commit to anything. And some historians have blamed that on the fact that she was a female leader. Some older historians have said that oh, well, she was a fickle woman and she just couldn't make up her mind. More recently, historians have said that they think that was actually a purposeful tactic, that if she didn't commit herself to anything and she just sort of delayed and put off making decisions, that was a tactic until she was sort of forced to commit to something. And so I think that this is probably an example of that, is that she needed the Danes in the 1580s. By the late 1590s and early 1600s, she didn't really need that alliance anymore. And so she would put off making a commitment until she could get sort of the complete lay of the land and see what was going to benefit the English and her agenda. Yeah.
Have they ever the Scandinavian settlers, when they couldn't find them, have they ever tried to check like the genealogy, or like know that they do blood tests, like how they do DNA? And did they know if like maybe they retreated further inland, and then like the animals led up that way, and they just,
Mhm.
they mated, came together with the natives in there? Or-
Yeah, the problem is that they're, I mean, there's nobody there. And so, and there have been some archaeological digs done of graveyards. And they found that, in one place for a while, they thought that they died out from the plague because the bodies were in very bad shape. And they seemed to have suffered from, like malnutrition and whatnot. But more recent tests have been done of them, and they concluded that it probably wasn't a disease that made people's bodies be this way, but just the harsh environment of the Arctic probably did. So, but yeah, there's been all kinds of studies about did they blend into the local Inuit population, and there's been further tests done, and they've concluded that probably not. There may have been a handful of like children who've been orphaned or whatnot that were adopted, taken in by individual families, but there doesn't seem to have been whole-scale absorption. The same thing in North America. There's been some studies about that, and they've concluded too that that probably isn't the case. That there probably weren't, integration between the native populations and the Scandinavians in North America either.
And since the Arctic's known for the storms, they could have sailed, and then who would due to the storms or the weather at that time,
Right.
they could have just had all the animal and everything.
Right.
And
And,
that sea.
yeah, and there's a really prominent historian now who has written a book up, and that's her theory, is that they all packed up and left to go to America. They sunk in the Davis Strait, and that they probably just ran into a storm and all disappeared that way. But nobody knows for sure.
How big a flotilla would it have taken to evacuate a community of that size? And did they have enough boats available?
Probably not by that point. That's the thing too, because Greenland doesn't have trees. And so, because it's the Arctic, and so they don't have trees to build ships in there. There is evidence that up to the 1300s they were traveling to North America to get wood, but there's only evidence of that up to about 1350-ish, and then there's no further evidence that they were going to America after that point. So they may not have been able to leave, even if they had wanted to.
That'd probably be why there was no ruins, maybe they took the wood from their houses when they realized it wasn't feasible. And then just left the stone foundations, and that could have.
Right, that could be it too. Yeah. If anybody wants to like find a good research topic, this is like one of these things that nobody has solved yet. So. All right, I think it's 1 o'clock. So thank you for coming.
There you go.
Okay, if you don't have to get back to the university right away, could I ask you a few more questions?
Yeah.
First of all, I'm wondering, you